Richmond in the spring of 1849 was a city stuffed with certainty. Counting houses hummed near the James River. Tobacco warehouses flanked the wharves like brick fortresses. Church Hill looked down on all of it, a ridge of columns and carriage lamps, where families with names older than the Republic kept their city homes. The people who lived there believed they knew their place in the world and everyone else's. That belief was about to split. Catherine Hargrove kept her belief polished like the silver in her dining room. She was 43, owner in practice of the Harrove tobacco fortune, and practiced at the quiet command that money and pedigree make effortless. Her husband Thomas rode the circuit as a judge and liked it that way. He loved law. He loved the miles between hearings. He did not love Richmond's rooms where conversations were really inventories of status. Catherine did. She carried those rooms like a second house. Inside the Franklin Street mansion, the rules were engraved in habit. Meals at the same hours, ledgers checked nightly, doors open in the afternoon so a passing visitor could see everything proper and nothing out of place. The household included 23 enslaved people. Among them Samuel, 31, tall, steady, literate by an old mistake no one spoke about, and for years Catherine's preferred attendant. He had been raised in the house. His mother Celia had raised Catherine. On Tuesday, March 6th, the weather turned strange. Warmth rolled up from the Carolinas and sat on the city like a damp quilt. By noon, Catherine dismissed the housemaids and sent the footmen across town on errands that would take hours. Only Samuel remained. She drew the curtains in her private sitting room. She locked the door. That sound was small and absolute. What happened inside that room never reached Catherine's official journal. That book held the price of flowers, the names of callers, the cost of new piano strings. It did not hold her loneliness, or the ruinous curiosity that loneliness becomes when no one will contradict it. Samuel later told his wife that Catherine began with instructions that broke the shape of their world. She told him to sit. She poured him tea. She spoke of a husband who loved distance. She spoke of Tuesdays that lasted a year. She touched his hand. Then she made a request that did not ask. Samuel left 3 hours later with an order of silence and the knowledge that there would be more Tuesdays. He walked through the hall with the stillness of someone who understands that resistance is a trapdoor built to look like a path. Catherine emerged with color in her face. The returning servants decided the heat had done it. 2 days passed. Habit stitched the house together again. On the third, the stitch came loose. Catherine visited her oldest friend, Eleanora Randolph, in a parlor that had seen 50 years of whispers without consequence. Catherine did not confess. She described curiosity instead of shame, logistics instead of sin. Eleanora listened with a mind trained by business and clan politics. She did not recoil. She asked about method. She asked about risk. She decided to test the border of that risk herself. Within 2 weeks, she sent for Isaac, a skilled man in the Randolph house. The pretext was a window latch. The latch held just fine. Afterward, Eleanora inventoried the risk-like inventory in a warehouse. She began a ledger written in cipher. Men were numbers. Women were letters. Tuesday and Thursday were the only days that existed. Catherine's Tuesday salons changed shape at the same time. 20 ladies became 8. The doors that should have stayed open clicked shut. The same male servants appeared each time. The talk began with the orphan asylum or church flowers and slid elsewhere, as soon as witnesses with reputations to protect had been dismissed. The 8 made signals and phrases and a map of secrecy. We will need additional linen meant yes. The roses require attention meant do not come. Each woman kept 2 ledgers, one for a husband's eyes and one for the truth. They called themselves the Sisterhood of Charity. The name was a sneer wrapped in respectability. The men had no choice. That fact sat in every corridor. Samuel stopped sleeping. Isaac stopped meeting his wife's eyes. Others learned to keep their faces still and their breathing quiet. Their bodies were demanded. Their silence was demanded more. To refuse was to invite the whip or sail south, or the loss of a wife or a child. A slave state teaches you the weight a signature can carry when the signature is not yours. The first people to see the whole shape of the thing were the enslaved women. They kept homes running. They watched everything because watching was insurance. In kitchens and laundries and back steps, they compared notes that white Richmond did not know were being taken. The same handful of men sent on errands to houses where they did not work. Doors locked in the afternoon. Ladies flushed in the evening. Men returning with that far stare you get when you are looking at a wall inside your head. Rachel in the Wickham house had nursed Margaret as a baby and carried a kind of authority that comes from years no one can erase. She was 53 and done with euphemism. One June morning she told Margaret that the thing must stop. Margaret answered with a threat disguised as concern for propriety. She reminded Rachel that a 14-year-old daughter could be sold to a place where life expectancy is an arithmetic problem with a short answer. Rachel held the line long enough to make clear she saw through the ritual. Then she left the room. She did not speak of it again to white ears. She spoke to the women who cooked and washed and waited. A quiet campaign of sand in the gears followed. Nothing a court could weigh. Enough to scratch the surface. The surface cracked for another reason in July. Thomas Hargrove returned 2 days early from the western counties. He reached his front door at the hour when Catherine's salon was supposed to be in full bloom. The door was locked from the inside. That was the first alarm. He walked in through the kitchen and up the hall before anyone could get ahead of him with a lie. The parlor door was locked too. He heard women's voices and one voice that was not. He knocked. Silence. Feet. A key. Catherine opened the door with her face arranged like a portrait. Her hair was slightly out of place. 5 ladies sat very straight. Samuel stood near the window with a posture that said shame rather than furniture moving. What is he doing here? Moving a desk? The light had changed. We needed to shift it. Samuel was just leaving. It sounded like one of those explanations people make when they think tone is more important than facts. Thomas let it pass in the moment. He did not let it pass in his mind. He began to watch. He counted locked doors. He counted which servants appeared. He counted how carefully his wife now managed the hour between 3 and 6. By August, the 8 women were bolder, which really means they were addicted. Catherine added 2 men from a country property to her rotation and wrote to herself that she had done it for practical reasons. Eleonora kept her cipher book in a locked desk and told herself that a code is a wall. It was a fence. Isaac could read. He had seen the journal. He learned where the key lived. With a wire taken from a broken corset stay and a patience born of necessity, he opened the lock one quiet night, copied pages, and hid them in oiled cloth beneath a loose stone. He showed Samuel. The copies were not a plan. They were proof you can hold in your hand. Proof requires a door. Samuel went to find one that might open. His mother cleaned at St. John's and knew a minister who preached the kind of sermons that draw frowns from rich pews. Reverend William Thompson had a reputation for duty and a habit of naming it out loud. Samuel asked for a meeting and brought fear with him. He spoke in the library at night, with the kind of careful language a man uses when the truth can get him sold. Thompson listened and went from doubtful to sickened, to angry in the way a decent man does, when the world shoves his ideals into a corner. Bring me the writing. Bring me witnesses if they will come. I will act. Samuel and Isaac found a night when Eleonora was feeding guests downstairs and opened the desk another time. They carried the journal through the streets like a live thing. Thompson and Samuel sat under a lamp and broke the simple cipher with simple patience. Names appeared. Dates appeared. Scores appeared. The mask fell off. The plan that followed would shake Richmond. Not because the city did not deserve the shaking, because the people who sat above it assumed nothing heavy enough could ever touch them. They were wrong. The knocks were coming. Reverend William Thompson had spent 11 years at St. John's Episcopal Church, preaching sermons about sin that his congregation preferred to take as metaphor. He was 62, gaunt, and famously unbending. His parishioners called him the Old Thunderhead behind closed doors. He believed the Bible without trimming it to suit fashion, and he believed that a slaveholder's soul was measured by what he did when no one was watching. He had no idea that belief would soon be tested against a horror he could scarcely imagine. When Samuel placed the stolen journal on Thompson's desk, the Reverend's first reaction was disbelief, followed by the steady pallor of comprehension. He read the first decoded page, then the next. Every line was a blow. Initials of women he had baptized, entries marked with dates and numbers, records of what they called arrangements, Thompson's jaw locked so hard that the muscles jumped along his cheekbones. "This cannot be the work of idle rumour," he said at last. "It is not rumour," Samuel answered. "I was there." Thompson looked up from the page. "If I bring this before the bishop, the entire city will burn with it. These women's husbands sit on the courts, the legislature, the boards that feed half of Richmond." Samuel met his eyes. "Then the fire is already burning, sir. It just burns in secret." The Reverend closed the book and exhaled like a man stepping into cold water. "Give me 3 days." The gathering storm. Thompson spent those days in prayer and research, pacing the floor of the rectory until the boards creaked like gunfire. He knew what exposing these women would mean: social collapse, scandal that abolitionists in the North would seize like carrion birds. Yet silence was complicity. When he finally walked to Bishop William Meade's residence, carrying the coded journal and his written translations, he felt as if he were walking into battle. The bishop read in silence. He was 73, a relic of a world that thought morality and hierarchy were the same thing. When he finished, his hands trembled against the paper. "If this is true," Meade whispered, "then our virtue is rot painted white." "It is true," Thompson said. "You may see the handwriting yourself. You may speak to the men if you dare." For a long time the bishop stared out the window toward Church Hill, where the grand houses glimmered like candles above the city haze. "I will call a private inquiry," he said finally. "5 men without ties to the accused. We will hear this in secret. If the evidence stands, it will go to the governor, and may God forgive Virginia." The inquiry. On the night of September 10th, the church library became a courtroom. Candles smoked, windows shuttered, air heavy with dust and dread. 5 respected men, merchant, physician, lawyer, landowner, professor, took their seats beside Bishop Meade. Reverend Thompson laid out the journal and his transcript. The reading began. Each page peeled away another layer of illusion. Names, dates, explicit details. The silence in the room deepened until even breathing seemed indecent. Then came the witnesses. Samuel spoke first, voice low but unwavering. He described Catherine Hargrove's summons, her words, her commands, the way refusal would have meant destruction. He did not cry, though one of the panel did. Isaac followed with his own story, of Eleanora Randolph, how the encounters were scheduled like duties and recorded in cipher. 3 more men confirmed the pattern. Finally, Rachel stepped forward, a grey-haired woman who had spent her life rocking white children to sleep. She told them about confronting Margaret Wickham, about the threat against her daughter. When she finished, not one man at the table could meet her eyes. Dr. Garrett, the physician, provided the last nail, his medical finding of a patient whose husband had been away for weeks. The conclusion required no imagination. When Bishop Meade rose, his voice shook. "Gentlemen, what we have heard tonight is not merely sin. It is moral inversion, our own creed turned inside out. These women must answer before both church and law." The decision was unanimous. The evidence would go to Governor Floyd at dawn. The governor's dilemma. John Floyd read the report with a face that darkened by degrees until he looked carved from blood and granite. He was no saint, but he understood politics. "If this becomes public," he said slowly, "it will tear Virginia's mask from her face. The North will gloat. The South will despise us. Our wives, our daughters, every one of them will be judged by this filth." "Then face it cleanly," Bishop Meade replied. "Better a wound that heals than a rot that spreads." Floyd stared at the papers again, then nodded. "I will summon the legislature. This cannot be hidden inside my office. Let the assembly decide what justice looks like when virtue wears silk gloves." Outside, the city carried on. Coaches clattering, tobacco smoke rising, laughter from taverns. No one knew that within 3 days their entire illusion of Southern honor would stand before judgment. The Reverend left the governor's mansion and walked alone through the midnight streets. Every window glowed with lamplight, every glow hiding something someone refused to name. He prayed, not for forgiveness, but for strength, because he understood the truth now. Richmond's sin was not in what had happened behind locked doors. It was in how many people would still choose to look away when those doors finally opened. Governor John Floyd did not sleep the night before the assembly met. His desk was covered with sealed letters, each hand-delivered to Virginia's most powerful men. The wording was careful. Urgent moral and legal matter of state importance. Attendance required. No one yet knew what awaited them. But rumor had already begun to circulate. Whispers of scandal reaching the drawing rooms of Church Hill, the offices on Main Street, and the tobacco warehouses by the river. By dawn, the whole city was holding its breath. At 9 o'clock on September 14, 1849, the chamber of the Virginia General Assembly filled with the uneasy shuffle of boots and whispered conjecture. The air was thick, the windows sealed against the late summer humidity. 60 legislators sat beneath the rotunda's high dome, their expressions a mix of impatience and dread. Governor Floyd stood at the front, pale but composed, holding a folder bound in black ribbon. When the gavel struck, the murmurs died. "Gentlemen," Floyd began, "I have called you here not for politics but for conscience. What you will hear in this room will shake your faith in the society we have built. It will stain our pride, and yet, to hide it would be to join the crime itself." He unfolded the bishop's report and began to read. The Chamber of Disbelief. At first the assembly listened in polite confusion. Then the words became clearer. 8 women of Richmond's highest families, a secret circle, the abuse of enslaved men. By the time Floyd reached the testimony of Samuel and Isaac, the chamber was frozen in silence. Men who prided themselves on self-control sat rigid, their knuckles white, their jaws tight. When the reading ended, Floyd laid the report on the podium. "This evidence," he said, "has been verified by inquiry, witnesses, and written documentation. The question before us is simple. What does justice demand?" Senator Thomas Ritchie rose first. His voice trembled with age and disbelief. "Governor, these are the daughters of men who built Virginia. Surely there must be some mistake, some false testimony." Floyd's reply was flat. "I would not have brought this before you without certainty. These women confessed in the language of their own hands. Their names are written in the journal I hold." The shock in the chamber turned to argument. Delegate Minor demanded to know how the words of slaves could be trusted. Another shouted that such stories would arm the abolitionists with poison against the South. Others murmured that sin was sin, no matter how well dressed. The debate went on for hours, voices rising and falling like waves. Some legislators clung to denial, others to anger. A few sat in haunted silence, realizing that the myth of Southern purity, the foundation of their whole world, was cracking under its own weight. Then, one man stood and changed the temperature of the voice of conscience. Delegate Samuel McDowell, barely 34, was known more for precision than passion. But when he spoke, his words cut through the chaos like a blade. "Gentlemen," he said, "we call ourselves men of honor, guardians of civilization, yet we sit here debating whether to excuse crimes simply because they wear silk and pearls. We say slavery is a sacred trust, that we guide an inferior race with Christian virtue, but these women have used that power to satisfy their own corruption. Tell me, where is the virtue in that? You speak of seduction, of temptation. What man among us believes that one who can be whipped or sold has power to tempt his owner? This was not seduction. This was coercion. These women used their position as weapon and shield, and they knew it. If we refuse to hold them accountable, we prove every abolitionist right. We prove that slavery is not a civilizing institution. It is rot disguised as order." For a long moment the chamber was silent. Then someone began to clap, slow and hesitant, until the sound spread through the room. Even men who disagreed with McDowell's politics could not deny the truth that had been spoken, the proposal of exile. By afternoon, the debate shifted from guilt to punishment. The law offered few precedents: adultery, fornication, unnatural relations, all punishable by fines, imprisonment, or public whipping. But the accused were not commoners. They were women of pedigree, connected by blood to judges, senators, and plantation barons. To drag them through a public trial would ignite national scandal. Senator Benjamin Watkins Lee proposed the compromise: permanent exile in place of public prosecution. The women would surrender all property to their husbands, forfeit any claim to inheritance, and leave Virginia forever. McDowell rose again. Exile may spare our reputation, but it mocks justice. Are we to teach that the powerful may buy mercy, while the powerless taste the lash? Lee's reply was calm and cruelly logical. We are teaching survival, not mercy. Public trials would expose every household in this state. Do you wish to see our wives and daughters stared at in the street? Let exile serve as punishment and quarantine both. The argument dragged into the night. When the final vote was called after 1 in the morning, the chamber split almost evenly. By a narrow margin, exile passed. A second vote determined the fate of the enslaved men who had testified. The assembly decided the state would purchase them from their owners, fair market value, and grant them conditional freedom. They were to leave Virginia within 30 days. If they returned, they would be re-enslaved. Justice in the assembly's eyes was not about equality. It was about containment. Finally, the legislature voted to seal the entire record for 75 years. The official reason was to protect the dignity of the Commonwealth. The real reason was simpler. Shame has a long memory, and Richmond wanted amnesia. The morning after, when dawn broke over Richmond, the streets looked unchanged, vendors opening stalls, carriages clattering, bells ringing from St. John's steeple. But inside the mansions of Church Hill, fear crawled under every door. Catherine Hargrove woke to find 3 men waiting in her foyer, a lawyer, a clerk, and a deputy with a folded document. The paper bore the state seal and 2 choices written in perfect legal script: accept exile and property forfeiture, or face public trial for moral crimes against nature. She read it once, her face expressionless, then handed it back. I will need an hour, she said. Her husband stood behind the officials, rigid as carved stone. So you knew, she murmured. I suspected, Thomas replied. I hoped I was wrong. Will you divorce me? I already have. Catherine smiled faintly, not from amusement, but from exhaustion. Then it seems we are both free. Outside, the carriages were already lining up for similar visits. The reckoning had begun, and by sunset, Richmond's proudest daughters would discover what it meant to be cast out of paradise. By sunrise on September 15th, Richmond no longer breathed the way it used to. The city that prided itself on decorum awoke to the sound of hooves and carriage wheels echoing through Church Hill. Deputies, clerks and lawyers in stiff collars moved house to house, delivering documents that would change Virginia's social map forever. Each envelope carried the same ultimatum: accept exile and forfeiture, or face public prosecution under the full weight of the law. Word spread faster than paper could travel. Servants whispered it first, then the merchants at the markets, then the tobacco men by the river. By mid-morning, a murmur had become a tremor. The grand neighborhood perched above the city's smoke now felt like a fortress under siege. Behind every shuttered window, women who once ruled Richmond's salons sat frozen in disbelief. Catherine Hargrove's reckoning. The first to receive her notice was Catherine Hargrove. The officials arrived just after dawn, when the air was cool and the lamps still burned low in the hallways. Catherine met them in her morning gown, composed and unhurried, her posture betraying none of the panic that had gripped the rest of Church Hill. The lead deputy cleared his throat and read the charges aloud in a tone that made the words sound both obscene and sacred. Acts of lewd coercion, abuse of position, adultery, and moral corruption against the laws of God and Commonwealth. When he finished, he presented the parchment for her signature. She read every word without blinking. Her husband, Judge Thomas Hargrove, stood behind her, his face drained of color but hard with quiet resolve. You knew, she said softly, the words a statement, not a question. I suspected, he replied, but I needed to be sure. And now? Now the law will finish what you began. She turned toward him, her voice level but cold. You have spent your life defending laws written by men who own other men, and you lecture me about corruption. You sit in judgment of me while building your fortune on the bodies of people who never chose their fate. Tell me, Thomas, what crime is worse, my defiance of a system or your devotion to it? He looked away, unable to answer. Will you divorce me? She asked. I already have, he said, barely above a whisper. Catherine nodded once, signed the document, and handed it back. Then I suppose that's the last honest thing either of us will ever do. By noon, her carriage was being loaded. 2 trunks of clothing, a jewelry box, and a small bundle of cash that the deputies allowed her to keep. She walked through her once bustling parlor without looking back, her heels clicking like a metronome of finality. When the carriage doors closed, she exhaled for the first time in months. Freedom was a cruel word, but it was still hers now. Eleanora Randolph's collapse. 3 streets away, Eleanora Randolph's household was a scene of hysteria. The officials found her trembling in her dressing room, clutching a letter that had arrived only minutes earlier, its wax seal unbroken, its message already guessed. When the charges were read, she collapsed. Her husband, a wealthy tobacco magnate, tried to lift her, but she clung to the deputy's sleeve, sobbing, "Please, I didn't mean it. It was Catherine. She tempted me. She led me astray." Her husband silenced her with a firm grip on her shoulders. "Eleanor, enough." His face was pale, but his voice steady. "You will not speak of others. You will sign what is before you and hold your dignity." The deputy, visibly uncomfortable, explained the terms: property forfeiture, exile, permanent separation from the enslaved men involved, and a binding silence. When asked if she understood, Eleanora simply nodded, her body shaking. After signing, she turned to her husband. "You could leave me. Everyone else will." "I made vows," he said. "Before God, I will not break them now." That single sentence silenced the room. It was the only act of grace the morning would see. The Randolphs left Richmond 3 days later for Philadelphia, escorted quietly by hired guards. As their carriage rolled through the streets, neighbors peeked through curtains and pretended not to look. In the city's private circles, the gossip began before the wheels had even left cobblestone. Margaret Wickham's defiance. Margaret Wickham reacted not with tears, but with fury. When the officials arrived, she refused them entry. "This is nonsense," she said, voice sharp enough to cut. "I am a Wickham of Jamestown lineage. I will not be accused of filth fabricated by northern agitators and lying servants." "Mrs. Wickham," the deputy said evenly, "these orders come from the governor himself. You may either comply or we will arrest you under the adultery statutes." "Arrest me?" she scoffed. "Do you have any idea who my family is?" Her lawyer arrived an hour later, summoned in panic, sweating from the climb up Church Hill. He spoke to her privately for several minutes. When they emerged, Margaret's face had changed. The fury had cooled into something worse, understanding. "They'll print every word," the lawyer said. "Every detail from that journal. You'll be paraded through courtrooms, and the scandal will stain your name for generations. Sign, leave, and at least the Wickham name survives." At noon she signed. Her hand shook only once. That evening, as she packed her trunks, she caught her reflection in the mirror, an image of elegance reduced to ruin. "They think this will erase us," she whispered to her daughter, who stood silently by. "But the ones who wrote the laws are filthier than those who broke them." Lucinda Epps and the silent collapse. Lucinda Epps didn't shout. She didn't plead. When the deputies read her charges, she simply stared through them, unblinking. Her husband stood beside her, cold and humiliated, until the physician declared that she had suffered a complete nervous collapse. She never fully recovered. Her family signed the exile papers on her behalf. She was sent north to live with distant cousins in Pennsylvania, who accepted her on the condition that she would never be left alone with male servants. She spent the next decade drifting between lucidity and silence, her mind trapped in a room without doors, the 8 departures. By week's end, all 8 women had left Richmond, some north, some south, some simply vanishing between rail lines and coastal steamships. Their departures were unannounced, their destinations whispered but uncertain. Carriages rolled away under cover of darkness. Curtains closed as they passed. Governor Floyd's office sent formal notifications to their husbands, finalizing property transfers and dissolving legal bonds. Church Hill's most powerful names were now ghosted by disgrace. Behind them, their mansions stood like hollow monuments, empty parlors, locked rooms, portraits staring down from walls that would never again host laughter. The men they left behind. For Samuel, Isaac, and the other men, the announcement of freedom came with a cruel edge. They were handed official papers signed by the governor himself, confirming manumission in recognition of testimony given in a matter of state importance. The documents also carried a warning: "You are forbidden to remain in the Commonwealth beyond 30 days. Freedom, it turned out, was just another kind of exile. Samuel spent the night staring at the paper by candlelight, tracing the letters with his finger, as if they might vanish by morning. "Free," he whispered, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. His wife Dinah sat beside him, silent, her eyes shining in the half-light. His mother Celia wept quietly in the corner. "We'll go north," Samuel said. "Philadelphia, maybe." "Start over. You think we can?" Dinah asked. "We have to. This city was never ours." The next morning, Samuel returned one last time to St. John's Church. Reverend Thompson met him in the small library, the same place where the risk had begun. The two men clasped hands. "You did what few men ever dare," Thompson said. "You told the truth when the truth could kill you." Samuel's voice was steady. "I didn't do it for courage, sir. I did it because I couldn't breathe anymore." The silence of Richmond. By the end of September, Richmond had rewritten its own memory. The official story, whispered into every parlor and printed in the discreet columns of local papers, claimed the 8 women had been implicated in financial irregularities. The words were harmless enough to preserve the city's facade. But in the quarters, kitchens and back alleys, the real story lived on. It spread quietly among those who had witnessed it, reshaped with each retelling but never erased. Rachel, the old nurse who had risked everything to speak up, kept the truth alive in her small house in Shockoe Bottom. At night, she'd sit on her porch and look toward Church Hill's dim lights. "Don't let them tell you they're better than you," she told her daughter. "I've seen what they become when nobody's looking." Richmond would bury the scandal in sealed archives, hide it under 7 decades of dust, and pretend it never happened. But history, like sin, does not stay buried forever. The foundations of Church Hill still remembered the footsteps that crossed its polished floors, the secrets whispered behind locked doors, and the shame that no proclamation could erase. The city moved on, but those who knew never forgot. By the first week of October 1849, Richmond looked outwardly unchanged. The tobacco barges still drifted down the James, the warehouses still exhaled smoke, and the carriages of the wealthy still rattled over cobblestones polished by generations of labor. But under that calm surface, something fundamental had broken. Church Hill's most respected women were gone, whisked away like ghosts in the night, and the city that once whispered their names with reverence now spoke them only in caution. The 8 exiles scattered like ashes in the wind. Each carried a different face of disgrace, a different method of survival, a different ghost of the city that had cast them out. Catherine Hargrove in New Orleans. Catherine Hargrove reached Norfolk under cover of rain. Her carriage wheels carved mud through the streets, the sound swallowed by the hiss of the tide. At the harbor, she boarded a steamship bound for New Orleans under the name Mrs. Ellen Carter, widow. It was a name borrowed from a servant's sister, chosen for its anonymity. On deck, she watched Virginia disappear behind a curtain of mist. The storm had passed, but the sea was still restless. She stood alone, face turned toward the wind, her eyes reflecting neither sorrow nor triumph, only a hollow clarity. In New Orleans, Catherine rented 2 small rooms above a French Quarter apothecary. She pawned what jewelry she had left and began writing under a false name for a local ladies' magazine, irony thick enough to choke on. Her essays spoke of morality, virtue, and restraint. The editors praised her refinement without ever knowing her past, but at night the mask slipped. She would stand by the window, watching the carriages rattle through the gaslit streets, and see in every flicker of lamplight the face of Samuel, the man who had been both her servant and her undoing. Some nights she hated him, some nights she pitied him, and some nights she hated herself for both. Catherine lived another 15 years in New Orleans, always alone, always writing. When she died in 1864, the obituary in the Picayune called her a widow of noble bearing and mysterious origin. No one in the city ever learned what noble house she had fallen from, or what sin had followed her across the sea. Eleanora Randolph's northward journey, Eleanora Randolph's exile was quieter but crueler. Her husband, true to his word, went with her. They traveled north by stagecoach, moving through towns that looked at them with curiosity and judgment. In Philadelphia, they rented a modest townhouse on Spruce Street, paid for in full by the husband's remaining wealth. Eleanora spent her days behind drawn curtains. Some said she never left the house again after the first winter. She took to writing endless letters, none of them mailed, addressed to her mother, her bishop, and the men she had wronged. In her journal, she wrote, "I once believed virtue was the absence of temptation. I see now it is the strength to bear it. I possessed neither. My sin was not desire, it was arrogance. I thought myself untouchable." Her husband tended to her like a nurse. He never spoke of the scandal, never blamed her aloud, but their love was embalmed rather than alive. When he died of fever in 1856, she wore black until her own death 2 years later. Her gravestone in Laurel Hill Cemetery bears no name, only the inscription, "A wife, a lesson." Margaret Wickham in Baltimore. Margaret Wickham arrived in Baltimore with the air of a woman who refused to recognize defeat. She rented a townhouse near the harbor, her daughter in tow, and announced herself as Mrs. Margaret Winslow of Virginia. The lie was brittle, but it served. She spent the next decade reinventing herself as a teacher of etiquette and refinement for the daughters of Baltimore's merchants, selling lessons in propriety she had once trampled in Richmond. The hypocrisy didn't bother her. Survival had replaced morality as her only compass. At night, when her daughter slept, she sometimes read the Bible aloud, not for comfort but for argument. She lingered on verses about judgment and punishment, reading them with the detached curiosity of a lawyer reviewing evidence. "If God forgives men their violence," she would whisper, "perhaps he will forgive me my rebellion." Margaret lived long enough to see the start of the Civil War. When Confederate troops entered Baltimore in 1861, she was said to have stood on her balcony and watched them march with a smile, a soldier of disgrace recognizing her own army at last. Lucinda Epps and the Long Silence. Lucinda Epps' mind had been broken by fear long before her body left Richmond. In Pennsylvania, her relatives kept her on the upper floor of a farmhouse outside Lancaster. They told the neighbors she was a widow with fragile nerves. She rarely spoke. On clear days, she would sit by the window staring north, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. Sometimes she murmured fragments of old hymns. Other times, a single sentence repeated like a curse: "The roses require attention." She died in 1857. Her family burned her journals and letters, fearing what they might contain. The only record of her passing was a line in the local paper. Mrs. L.E., a gentlewoman of refinement, passed peacefully after a long illness. The fate of the others. The remaining 4 women vanished into the noise of history. One fled to Charleston under another name. Another was rumored to have gone to London with distant cousins. 2 simply disappeared, their identities swallowed by the anonymity of exile. Church Hill never spoke of them again. Their portraits were taken down, their names struck from family Bibles. Children were told that Aunt Catherine or Cousin Eleanora had died of fever or moved abroad. Silence became inheritance, Samuel's exodus. Samuel left Richmond on October 3rd, his wife Dinah beside him and his mother wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill. Their wagon rattled north along roads lined with dying leaves. Every turn of the wheel carried him farther from the place that had shaped and scarred him. In Philadelphia, he found work as a carpenter. The city's free black community welcomed him cautiously. Freedom from Virginia was a story too rare to question, but too dangerous to celebrate. Within a year, he had saved enough to rent a small house. Dinah took in sewing. Celia kept the home. At night, when the noise of the city faded, Samuel would sit by candlelight, writing in a small leather journal. He wrote not for publication, but for preservation, for a record that truth had existed once, even if no one wanted to hear it. He wrote about Catherine's voice, about the weight of her gaze, about the guilt that never left him even after freedom. In 1853, he learned through rumor that Isaac had reached New York and begun speaking at abolitionist gatherings. The thought frightened him at first. Then it made him proud. He knew that Isaac's courage carried the story further than any court ever would. Isaac's testimony. In New York, Isaac found the freedom to speak. He adopted the name Isaac Thompson in honor of the reverend who had risked everything to help them. At meetings in small churches and rented halls, he told his story, not the names, not the city, but the truth of what slavery allowed. Power corrupts not just the master. he told one audience in 1853. But the mistress, the overseer, the preacher, the judge, you cannot give one person ownership of another's body and expect goodness to survive. Slavery rots the soul of everyone who touches it. His words spread among abolitionist circles like wildfire. They appeared slightly altered in pamphlets and speeches. Some called him a liar. Others called him a prophet. He never returned south. He married a free woman in New York, fathered 2 children. Anne died in 1861, the same year Virginia seceded from the Union. He did not live to see the war, but his testimony survived in abolitionist archives, stripped of his name but not his meaning. Rachel's final years, Rachel. The woman who had first dared to confront her mistress lived long enough to see freedom declared by war rather than mercy. She remained in Richmond, old and poor but unbroken. The city changed around her, emancipation, occupation, reconstruction, but she carried her truth quietly to the end. In 1860, a neighbor's child overheard her say, "They built their houses on our backs, and then buried their sins under their floors. But the ground remembers." She died that same year, buried in Richmond's African burial ground. No stone bore her name, but every woman who came after her inherited a fraction of her defiance, the weight of silence. By 1924, the sealed records of the Sisterhood of Charity were finally unsealed in the Virginia State Archives. The clerks who opened the vault found stacks of parchment yellowed with age, brittle but legible. They read the testimonies, the coded journal, the governor's decrees and the assembly's votes. The archivists didn't know what to do with what they found. Some pages disappeared within weeks, stolen, destroyed, or quietly refiled under miscellaneous private inquiries. The few that survived became footnotes in obscure historical reports, but the truth had already escaped long before. It lived in whispered stories, in the memories of families whose ancestors had survived both bondage and shame. It lived in the journals of Samuel and the speeches of Isaac. It lived in the silent defiance of women like Rachel, who refused to let history lie. Richmond would grow, burn, rebuild, and modernize. Yet beneath the city's polished streets, beneath the manicured lawns of Church Hill, the soil still remembered. The shame, the silence, and the sin remained buried there, not erased, only waiting. And history, patient as time itself, was still listening. The year was 1924. 75 years had passed since Virginia locked away the scandal that nearly cracked its social spine. The world had changed. Steam had given way to electricity. Empires had collapsed. The South had lost its war and learned to pretend it had not. But in the basement of the Virginia State Archives, behind an iron door labeled Private Inquiries, sealed by order of Governor John Floyd, 1849, the past waited like a corpse that refused to rot. The archivist who opened that vault was not looking for ghosts. His name was Edward Langston, 33 years old, newly hired, meticulous, and burdened with the naive belief that history was a science of order. His supervisor had instructed him to catalogue a series of forgotten legislative transcripts. What Langston found instead was a stack of boxes coated in 75 years of dust. The paper labels still faintly legible, Church Hill Inquiry. He pried one open, expecting dull financial proceedings. The first page changed his life. The discovery. The handwriting was elegant, looped, feminine, practiced. It was not the script of a clerk, but of a woman educated in the old style. The title read, Record of the Sisterhood of Charity, March 1849. Beneath it, an index of names, Hargrove, Randolph, Wickham, Epps. Langston read for nearly an hour before he realized he had stopped breathing properly. The words were both obscene and sacred, evidence of power twisted, sanctity defiled, and justice handled like a porcelain dish no one dared drop. He read of the inquiry, the testimonies of enslaved men, the secret legislative session, and the punishment of exile. When he reached the final declaration, to be sealed until the year 1924, at which time it shall be reviewed, and either destroyed or entered into permanent record, his hands began to shake. Destroy it or preserve it. No instructions on which path to choose. Langston closed the box and leaned back in his chair, the hum of the electric lights above him sounding like judgment. The archivist's dilemma. For days, Langston read in secret. The story consumed him. He worked late after the other staff had gone, the faint smell of dust and old ink filling the silence. The characters of 1849 came alive in his mind. Catherine's arrogance, Eleanora's collapse, Samuel's courage, Isaac's defiance. He could not decide which was worse, the crimes themselves or the precision with which Virginia had buried them. He took notes in a private journal, mirroring Samuel a lifetime earlier, but he knew what this discovery meant. If he published the files as they were, the descendants of those families, still powerful in Richmond politics, would destroy him. Yet to hide the truth again would make him another accomplice in the cover-up that had already lasted 3 generations. Each night, he carried a single page home, concealed under his coat, and copied it by hand. He wrote not as an archivist, but as a witness. The descendant, on a rainy afternoon in April 1924, a visitor arrived at the archives asking for information on Governor Floyd's sealed proceedings. She introduced herself as Amelia Randolph Carter, a historian from the University of Virginia. Langston froze at the name. "Randolph," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "My great-grandmother was Eleanora Randolph. I've been tracing family records. Every line of our genealogy stops abruptly in 1849, as though she ceased to exist. I want to know why." Langston hesitated. He should have refused her. The files were still marked restricted. But the look in her eyes, tired, intelligent, determined, made him pause. "Come back after closing," he said quietly. "I'll show you what the state never wanted you to see. Truth in the basement." At 7 p.m. the doors were locked, the lights dimmed, and the storm outside pressed its grey face against the windows. Langston led Amelia down the stairs to the basement vault. The key turned with a metallic groan. Inside, the smell of mold and history met them like breath from another century. He laid out the folders on the table. "Read," he said. She read for nearly an hour without speaking. Her gloved fingers trembled as she turned the pages, the coded journal of her ancestor, the testimony of Isaac, the verdict of exile. When she reached the bishop's declaration, "May God have mercy on us all," she set the paper down and covered her face with both hands. "So this is what they hid," she whispered. "This is the curse we've inherited." Langston watched her. "You had no idea." She shook her head. "In my family, Eleanora was described as a woman who suffered from nerves. That's all they said. No mention of what she did or what was done to those men. Just silence." Her voice hardened. "We are not supposed to have saints in our bloodlines, but we must face our monsters too." The decision. When she finished reading, Amelia turned to him. "Will these documents be published?" "Not yet," Langston said. "The board will review them. The families still hold influence. They may bury this again. Then we can't let them," she said firmly. "The truth isn't theirs anymore." Langston hesitated. "If we release this, you'll lose your family's reputation. Everything your name still carries." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "My family built that reputation on lies. I'd rather inherit disgrace than ignorance." Together, they began copying the files, photographs, transcripts, and witness statements, planning to send them to multiple historical societies and newspapers. If the state tried to destroy one copy, others would remain. The resurrection of the story. Within months, whispers spread through Richmond's academic circles. A long-buried scandal had been uncovered, an 1849 inquiry into unspeakable crimes committed by women of high station. By autumn, the Richmond Gazette printed the first sanitized version, followed by a more daring article in the Baltimore Sun titled "The Sisterhood of Charity, Virginia's Forgotten Trial." The reaction was explosive. Some called it slander, an attack on Southern womanhood. Others called it the first honest reckoning with the moral rot of slavery. Churchill's descendants tried to sue for defamation, but the evidence was irrefutable, written in their ancestors' own hands. Amelia's name appeared in the byline of a follow-up article, "History is not a scandal, it is a mirror." Her final paragraph read, "The women who built their lives on virtue committed the vilest acts imaginable because no law restrained their power. The men who owned those women hid the evidence to preserve their pride. But the enslaved men who risked everything to tell the truth, Samuel, Isaac, and the others, proved that moral strength is not born of freedom, but of conscience. Richmond forgot them. We will not. The unfinished ledger Langston died in 1931, struck by a car on Broad Street. When the police inventoried his apartment, they found a locked trunk containing the complete transcriptions of the Church Hill inquiry. His copies became the basis for modern historians' understanding of the scandal. Amelia lived long enough to see the 1940s. She continued teaching history, refusing any position that required her to sanitize the past. When she died, she left instructions for her ashes to be scattered over the James River, the same river her ancestors' shame had overlooked. Her students said she never spoke of Eleanora again. But she often ended her lectures with a single line: "You cannot build virtue on silence. Sooner or later, the truth knocks." The echoes beneath Richmond. A century later, Church Hill had gentrified into polished streets and boutique cafes, but the past still lived beneath its foundations. Construction crews occasionally unearthed old cellar doors or sealed basements, where the plaster still bore faint traces of imported French wallpaper. And every so often, when the city's humidity pressed heavy and the air smelled faintly of tobacco and decay, someone swore they could hear whispers through the walls of those old houses. Faint, rhythmic like the turning of a lock, and a voice saying, "The roses require attention." Richmond never built a monument for the Sisterhood of Charity, nor for the men who endured them. The city chose progress over penance, as it always had. But history, patient as ever, waits for those who will listen. Because the truth once spoken never sleeps again. By the late 1970s, Richmond had learned to live with selective memory. The civil rights movement had forced the city to confront some of its ghosts, but not all. Church Hill, once the citadel of antebellum privilege, had decayed into crumbling porches and peeling shutters. Preservationists called it historic charm. Locals called it haunted. Developers began buying the old mansions, gutting the insides to make way for apartments. It was during one such renovation, an 1840s home on Franklin Street, that the past surfaced again, this time in the literal sense. The unearthed cellar. It was August of 1978. Construction worker Harold Jackson, a wiry man from Petersburg with a quick wit and a slower temper, was breaking through a sealed section of the mansion's basement wall when his pickaxe struck hollow. Behind the bricks lay a hidden chamber, no larger than a horse stall. Inside, a small iron cot, rusted chains bolted to the floor, and a leather-bound book so brittle it nearly turned to powder when touched. The house had once belonged to Judge Thomas Hargrove. Police were called. The site was cordoned off. The book was sent to the Virginia Historical Society for examination. It contained no names, only initials and brief, cryptic entries written in two hands, one delicate and feminine, the other rough and deliberate. One passage stood out: "He will not look at me anymore. I think he dreams of running." But where could he go? The roses require attention. The experts recognized the phrase immediately. It matched the cipher from the Church Hill inquiry, unsealed 50 years earlier. The return of the past. The discovery reignited public obsession. Newspapers resurrected the scandal of 1849 with fresh appetite. Television crews descended on Church Hill, broadcasting live from the crumbling mansions where Richmond's most shameful secret had been born. But what fascinated people most wasn't the scandal itself. It was the idea that something tangible still lingered beneath the surface. The rumors spread faster than the official reports. Hidden rooms where enslaved men had been imprisoned, journals that described rituals of ownership, tunnels connecting mansions to river docks. Historians argued, priests denounced, politicians begged the city to let the matter die again. But it wouldn't. The city's conscience had cracked open, and something old had begun to seep out. The researcher. Among those drawn to the story was Dr. Lillian Monroe, a young black historian from Howard University. Her grandmother had told her stories about the Richmond men who vanished, tales whispered in kitchens generations after emancipation. Dr. Monroe arrived in Richmond in early 1979 with a grant to research postbellum memory and moral reconstruction. But her private goal was simpler: to find proof that the stories her grandmother told were real. She spent weeks combing through archives, interviewing descendants, and visiting the surviving mansions. The more she uncovered, the more the official record seemed like a performance, neat, contained, bloodless. The truth she sensed was messier and much darker. One night, while reviewing microfilm at the archives, she found a forgotten note tucked inside Langston's transcriptions. If the ground remembers, start where the cellar meets the river. Langston's handwriting. A clue. Half a century old, the hidden passage following the note. Munro traced property maps of 19th century Church Hill. She discovered that several mansions had once been connected to storage tunnels leading down to Shockoe Bottom, Richmond's old slave trading district. Most had been sealed or collapsed, but one route still aligned with the Hargrove property. With the building's new owner's reluctant permission, Munro and a small team descended through the half-collapsed basement in October 1979. The air was foul and heavy. The tunnel stretched barely 50 yards before caving in, but along its walls were faint scratches, letters, symbols, even full words carved into the brick with desperate precision. She traced one with her flashlight, Sam. Next to it, barely legible, "For Dinah, remember me." Munro froze. She knew the name from the inquiry records. Samuel, the man whose testimony had begun it all. Her assistant whispered, "Could he have been kept here?" Munro didn't answer. She just stared at the wall, her throat tightening. The initials weren't just markings. They were a message from beneath history's floorboards. The public reaction. When Munro published her findings in the Journal of Southern History, the backlash was immediate. Descendants of the Hargroves and Randolphs called her a liar, accusing her of fabricating evidence to tarnish noble families. Newspapers printed editorials demanding the state protect Virginia's heritage from revisionist zeal. Munro received death threats, but she refused to retract a single word. In a televised interview, she said, "They call this heritage. I call it pathology. They built their wealth on silence, and silence has no right to comfort." The clip aired nationwide. Overnight, she became both hero and heretic, hailed by scholars, hated by Richmond's old guard. The Unquiet Ground in 1980, excavation of a new sewer line beneath Church Hill, uncovered human remains. 6 male skeletons, all adult, all buried without coffins. Forensic analysis confirmed they dated to the mid-19th century. Iron wrist restraints were still attached to 2 of them. The city called them laborers lost in a collapse. Dr. Munro called them the missing 17. The state refused to open a full investigation, citing insufficient context. The bones were quietly reburied at East End Cemetery under a simple marker that read, "Unknown workman, ca. 1850. But the people of Richmond's black community knew better. They left flowers. They left notes. Some even poured whiskey on the soil, whispering, "We remember." The ghost of a city. By the end of the decade, Church Hill had become a paradox, its restored mansions gleaming while its history festered underneath. Tour guides avoided mentioning the Sisterhood of Charity, except in hushed ghost walks that reduced tragedy to theatre. Dr. Munro moved on to teach at Georgetown, but kept a single brick from the Hargrove cellar on her office shelf. When asked about it, she would say, "That brick heard more truth than most people ever speak." Before her death in 2001, she wrote one final essay, unpublished in her lifetime. "History is not what we choose to remember. It is what refuses to let us forget." Richmond built itself on denial. Every century or so, the earth cracks open to remind it that silence is not absolution. It's just delay. The memory that endures. Today, tourists walk past the manicured streets of Church Hill, unaware that the ground beneath them once held the weight of both elegance and atrocity. But sometimes, especially on humid summer nights when thunder rolls over the James, locals swear they can hear faint echoes from the basements, the rattle of chains, the soft closing of a parlor door, a woman's voice whispering, "The roses require attention." No historian can prove it. No priest can cleanse it, but every truth leaves residue. And Richmond, despite its monuments and museums, remains a city still haunted by what it chose to hide. By the 21st century, Church Hill had transformed again, this time into something uncomfortably picturesque. Cafes filled the old parlors. Airbnbs occupied the mansions that had once hidden their sins behind imported wallpaper. Tourists strolled through cobbled lanes with lattes in hand, admiring Old South charm, oblivious that they were walking across a graveyard built from silence. Richmond, ever expert in reinvention, had learned how to sell its ghosts, but memory has a way of keeping score. The documentary in 2018, a young filmmaker named Naomi Pierce arrived in Richmond to shoot a graduate thesis on hidden narratives of Southern womanhood. She had read Dr. Lillian Monroe's papers, and one footnote caught her attention. A cryptic mention of the missing 17 and a half-destroyed ledger once owned by Catherine Hargrove. No major historian had followed the lead. The subject was still toxic, the evidence scattered, the city still unwilling to dig where the truth slept. That was exactly why Naomi came. She rented a small apartment on Franklin Street, unaware at first that it stood across from the ruins of the Hargrove property. Within weeks, she was obsessed. She combed through local archives, family Bibles, and forgotten microfilm reels. She found references to a sealed vault of feminine scandal and letters between descendants who had tried, decades earlier, to suppress the story again after the 1970s rediscovery. The more she read, the more she felt the story watching her. The Whispering House. Naomi's apartment creaked constantly, as old buildings do, but one night in February 2019, she heard something different. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced, coming from behind a section of plaster near the fireplace. At first she thought it was plumbing, or the building settling. But the knocks repeated, same rhythm, same pause between. She tore away the old wallpaper the next morning. Behind it she found a wooden panel sealed with rusted nails. Inside the narrow cavity was a small metal box containing folded papers, water-stained and brittle. The first page bore the initials CH. The second contained a single line, faint but legible. They said I would be forgotten, but I left my confession where the walls could remember. Naomi sat on the floor for hours, reading through the fragments. Catherine's handwriting was unmistakable, arrogant and lucid even in ruin. The notes were dated 1853, written 4 years after her exile. She described New Orleans, her loneliness, and her attempt to understand the hunger that destroyed us all. In one passage she wrote, "We believed ourselves trapped in our own cages, so we built cages for others. I do not ask forgiveness. I ask understanding, so that none will repeat what power permits." Naomi realized what she was holding wasn't just history. It was an autopsy of guilt. The return of the sisterhood. Naomi's discovery became the spine of her documentary, The Roses Require Attention. She interwove Catherine's confessions with Dr. Monroe's research and the 1924 archive findings. It was a brutal, unsentimental portrait of Virginia's moral hypocrisy, a story told not through outrage, but through evidence. When the film premiered at a small festival in Washington, it ignited a storm. Richmond's Historical Society called it inflammatory and irresponsible. The descendants of the Randolph and Wickham families threatened legal action. The mayor's office released a statement calling for contextualized reconciliation, the modern bureaucratic phrase for silence. But something unexpected happened. The people of Richmond, students, teachers, ordinary residents, lined up to see it. The theater sold out for 3 nights. Younger generations, unburdened by inherited pride, demanded to know why no museum had ever acknowledged the event. The controversy forced the Virginia Historical Society to reopen the Churchill Inquiry Collection for public viewing. For the first time, the coded journal, the testimonies, and the legislative decrees were displayed under glass. The graves and the names in 2020. Archaeological surveys began under Shockoe Bottom, where developers planned to build new housing. What they uncovered stunned even the skeptics. 12 more graves, all male, all from roughly 1845–1855. Iron, cuffs and broken wooden collars lay beside the bones. DNA analysis linked one set of remains to a living family in Philadelphia, descendants of Samuel's line. The discovery confirmed what historians had long suspected. At least some of the men who disappeared in 1849 had never been sent away. They had been buried quietly beneath the city that enslaved them. The state ordered a memorial. The city approved it reluctantly. When the monument opened in 2022, it stood not on Church Hill but in Shockoe Bottom, where the slave markets once operated, and where the river still carried the smell of iron and rain. The monument bore 17 names recovered from archival fragments, and one inscription from Catherine's final confession. Silence was our first sin. The Last Voice. Naomi's film gained national attention. She was invited to speak at universities, asked to write a book, even offered a museum consultancy. But what haunted her most wasn't the fame, it was the feeling that the story still wasn't finished. One night during a live interview, a caller phoned in. The line crackled. The voice was old, trembling, male. "I know where the others are," the caller said. "The ones they didn't bury in Richmond." Naomi froze. "Who is this?" The caller hesitated. "My great-grandfather was a Hargrove. My family kept something. A journal. It says they sent some of the men west to hide what the inquiry missed. I'm dying. If you want the truth, come get it before the house is sold." The call disconnected. The studio traced it to a number in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the same city where Catherine Hargrove had died in exile. Naomi booked a ticket the next morning. The Baton Rouge Journal. The man was 91, bedridden and blind. His name was Henry Hargrove. On his nightstand sat a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 3 items: a locket with Catherine's portrait, a key, and a journal written in the same handwriting as her original confessions. The entries were dated from 1856 to 1861. Catherine described her final years in exile, the men she saw trafficked through New Orleans, the way wealth flowed from Virginia's plantations into Louisiana's markets, and her realization that sin migrates like money. It never dies, it only changes hands. In the last entry she wrote, "They buried the bodies under our parlors and built parlors over our guilt. I will not beg for redemption. I only ask that one day someone will dig deep enough to find us." Naomi filmed the reading of that final entry for the closing scene of her documentary. The camera lingered on her face as she whispered the words aloud. Behind her, the Mississippi shimmered in the afternoon sun, indifferent and eternal. The Reckoning. When the film's final version aired globally in 2023, Richmond could no longer pretend. The Church Hill mansions, symbols of old Southern grace, were forced to confront their foundations. Tourists stopped taking smiling photos on Franklin Street. Schools added the Sisterhood of Charity to local history curricula. The once whispered phrase, "The roses require attention," became shorthand for buried truths across the South. And yet, even after all the revelations, there was no triumph. Only a quiet, uneasy awareness that some stains never wash out. Naomi returned to the city one last time in the summer of 2024. She visited Shockoe Bottom's memorial at dusk. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas droning like distant hymns. She knelt beside the plaque and laid a single rose. When the wind shifted, she thought she heard a voice, a woman's, faint but unmistakable, whispering from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "Tell them we were here." Naomi closed her eyes and whispered back, "I already have." The sun dipped behind the James River. The city exhaled. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Richmond was quiet. Not because it had forgotten, but because finally it had remembered.